All right, let's see it.
It was more important for God to make sure that I didn't wear mixed fabrics than it was to make sure that I knew that slavery was immoral.
The only mixing of certain fabrics that was prohibited was with wool and linen. How many of us today are walking around mixing wool and linen in our clothing? Not too many.
So, two issues here. First, you can look online and find all kinds of clothing that mixes wool and linen. Second, this is not accurate. There are two different places where this commandment is found, and as with many commandments that are found in two different places, they conflict with each other, and we can either try to force them to be harmonized and alter our reading of both of them, or we can allow these differences to stand. But that complicates the attempt to try to reduce the Bible down to one single message. In Leviticus 19:19, we just have these series of don't mix these two things together commandments, and it says to not wear a garment of mixed fabric. And the word there is just sha'atnez, which is a loan word from Egyptian. And it seems to mean something like adulterated or inappropriately mixed. It's Deuteronomy 22:11 that adds to the word sha'atnez the specification of wool and linen. And whether that is just supposed to be such as wool and linen, whether that's supposed to identify fabric that is sha'atnez as fabric that is mixing wool and linen specifically, or what is not clear, and forcing Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22:11 to agree with each other is just imposing our will on the text and telling it what it is allowed to say.
But even if we were, this was done away with the ceremonial law, because that's what it was, not a moral law. And it was done away with in the New Testament.
So this is flatly false. There is no part of the New Testament that in any way, shape, or form distinguishes ceremonial from moral laws, much less declares that everything that is a moral law is to remain in force, whereas everything else is to be gotten rid of. That distinction is something that was created in the 3rd century CE among early Christians, and then later the laws were reshuffled to include a civil dimension. And this distinction was really created in order to validate, to justify Christians maintaining certain laws from the Hebrew Bible and rejecting other laws from the Hebrew Bible. It was a way to allow them to pick and choose what remained in force and what didn't. But if you look at the attempts by early Christians and even Christians today to maintain certain laws in force and to get rid of others, you will see that they're always a mixture of ceremonial and moral laws. For instance, in Acts 15, following the Jerusalem Council, when the apostles write this letter to all the Gentile believers and say, we're only really going to hold you to 3 laws. Those 3 laws are a mixture of moral and ceremonial. Abstain from fornication, abstain from things polluted by idols, and abstain from eating food that had been strangled or from eating blood. So that's a mixture of moral and ceremonial laws. Even the 10 Commandments is a mixture of moral and ceremonial laws. So it's very clear that distinction is a secondary and an arbitrary one that is intended only to validate the picking and choosing of what laws are to be kept and what laws are to be ignored.
Now, the abolition of slavery was led by Christians such as Abraham Lincoln, William Wilberforce, Frederick Douglass.
So there are a whole boatload of problems with this attempt to leverage the Bible as rhetorical prophylaxis for the Bible's own unilaterally pro-slavery stance, not least of which the fact that Abraham Lincoln was only reluctantly compelled to take an abolitionist stance. He explicitly said if he could have kept the Union together without abolishing slavery, that would have been his preference. Now, it took almost 2,000 years for people to decide that slavery was bad and then go look in the Bible for ways to argue that the slavery is bad. Prior to that, the Bible was unilaterally deployed in defense of and in advancing the interest of European imperialism, slavery, and racism. In fact, it was Christians who invented the concept of race as something based on skin color precisely to defend and advance the interests of European imperialism. If you'd like some academic discussions of the role of the Bible and Christianity within debates about slavery and white supremacy, particularly in the 19th century, this article is freely available online. I'd also highly recommend David Goldenberg's book, Black and Slave: The Origins and History of the Curse of Ham. Francisco Betancourt's book Racisms from the Crusades to the 20th Century does a great job of discussing the role of Christianity in the development of racism as a means of protecting and advancing the interest of European imperialism. Now, when it comes to contemporary Christianity and the role of the Bible in white supremacy, J. Russell Hawkins' The Bible Told Them So, How Southern Evangelicals Fought to Preserve White Supremacy is a very good discussion. As is Anthea Butler's White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. I would also highly recommend Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And for my co-religionists out there, I think you should also check out Mormonism and White Supremacy.
And even back in the Old Testament, you have Israelites that would have been against this type of slavery. They were up for business contracts, and it was actually saving the lives of those who were living in abject poverty, or criminals were entering in. And after 7 years, they were allowed to go free. So the practices were even more humane. You have to wrestle with these two, and you start to see the falsity in this claim.
So this is a profoundly misguided, misleading, and harmful attempt to try to sing the praises of debt slavery as a rhetorical smokescreen for the fact that the Hebrew Bible explicitly endorses chattel slavery. So there were two different types of slavery that could be imposed according to the Hebrew Bible. For your fellow Israelite, it was supposed to be debt slavery, which was absolutely more humane than chattel slavery, but is not a rejection of chattel slavery in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. The Hebrew Bible explicitly endorses chattel slavery in Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46. And this was not just for criminals. This was for anyone who was not an Israelite. Now, you could only impose debt slavery upon your fellow Israelite, which was absolutely more humane than chattel slavery, but still slavery and still absolutely abominable. And it was inconsistent from one part of the Hebrew Bible to another. So, for instance, according to Exodus, it was only men who went free after 6 years of debt slavery. Female debt slaves who had been sold into slavery by their fathers because they couldn't sell themselves into slavery, were to be permanent debt slaves. And that's because they were very obviously going to be sex slaves. And they were tainted goods once they had spent 6 years subjected to that type of slavery. So setting them free was to set them loose into a society that had no use for them, really. Now, Deuteronomy is going to say all debt slaves in the 7th year go free, male and female, which is arguably not any better because it is setting them free into a society that does not really have any use for them. However, Deuteronomy also does say that you're supposed to give them provisions when you let them go, and Exodus says no such thing whatsoever. So there were different types of debt slavery represented throughout the Hebrew Bible, and that was the only type of slavery you were supposed to be able to impose upon your fellow Israelite. But for non-Israelites, chattel slavery was absolutely endorsed in the Bible. And this creator would do well to get better educated about their Bible and about the background of its creation.